Thank you so much. I'm very keen to be speaking. So, I would like to be talking about a particular interpretation of 40K that I've been developing. It has a number of pieces, so I'm going to need to talk quite quickly to get through all of this. I apologize if any detail is lost, and I'm hoping that we can get to that detail more in the discussion, which I'm very much looking forward to. I would like to start by talking about the method that I'm using for analyzing 40K, moving on to the theoretical framework, and then applying that directly to 40K so I can start to think through the idea of it as being a fundamentally broken universe. From there, I'm going to try and apply that back to our world to try and look at some of the ways in which 40K functions as a mirror for some of our concerns, and end up by talking about why we care about all this, why we find it so interesting and compelling, what it speaks to in us. So, start off with the method. So, what I would like to do is investigate 40K as a kind of cultural dream work. I want to try and unpack what that means here. Start off with, my guiding focus is these questions that we have on the screen here. What is it about this universe that is so compelling to us? What is it that draws and sustains our interest? Or another way of putting that, what are we doing when we engage with 40K? My interpretive strategy is to say that in some sense or another, 40K is engaging to us because it is a mirror that reflects something of our own deepest interests and concerns back to us. What it does is it gives us a kind of symbolic language through which we can understand ourselves and the world around us, something like a periscope we can use to see things we might not otherwise be able to see. And when we look at 40K, in a certain sense, what we see is ourselves, particularly ourselves as historically constituted subjects. I'm going to unpack all of that as we go. So, to begin with, this term cultural dream work, what do I mean by all this? So, start off with dream work, of course, comes from psychoanalysis, where Freud and the Freudian tradition view dreams, you might say, as a type of thinking, as a type of problem solving that goes on in our sleep. Three particular mechanisms in dreaming that are particularly important for our purposes. First is mechanism of condensation. There is a latent collection of dream thoughts that all come together and are put in one form. So what you find is that a certain figure in a dream, like say you dream of a sinister man outside your room, will turn out to be a combination of many, many different figures, and in that sense will be over-determined, will have a multitude of meanings within the one figure. Displacement is another crucial mechanism of dreaming. The idea is that if there is a certain thought or feeling or experience that causes overwhelming anxiety, the dream will displace that onto a slightly different topic. So, for example, if the idea of your parents being angry with you is too frightening to deal with, you might have a dream in which there is a violent storm, and the storm might express something of the idea of anger, but in a way that's more palatable so that you can approach it. Finally, dreams will operate in symbols. When Carl Jung talks about symbols and man as symbols, he says that symbols are something that kind of connotes or expresses an indefinite range of meanings that go a little bit beyond our capacity to represent them in words. All right, so if this is dreams, of course, dreams are private events that go on inside your mind while you're sleeping. Art is not private, it's public, it's accessible to all of us. And there are interesting theoretical perspectives, again, which we can explore more later, in which artistic creation is seen as a kind of transformation of unconscious processes, making them visible. And the experience of engaging with an artwork is thought of as being something like a waking dream. It's this kind of process where we enter into a half dreamlike state and go through a kind of dream work by engaging with it. Now, what's interesting about 40K is that it is not the creation of a single author, and it doesn't bear the imprint of that author's psychology so much. It is a palimpsest. It is a work by accretion assembled by dozens of contributors over nearly 4 decades of its existence. And what I think that process does is it creates a kind of leveling out of individual differences and of individual idiosyncrasies and merges them together in a kind of a culturally significant product, much as, this is a very sacrilegious thing to say, much as the Bible is a product of a historically extended tradition. So what I'm thinking of in 40K is of it as an expression, you might say, of a culture's dreams, a certain historically extended community solving problems in a certain way. What I'm not doing is taking 40K literally. I'm not interested so much in questions like, why did the emperor destroy Monarchia? Wasn't that a silly thing to do? I'm taking it that 40K is a bearer of metaphors, symbols, impressions first, and the literal content is there to support the symbols rather than vice versa. So let's look at the actual theoretical framework that I'm using here. So the framework I'm using comes from American scholar Camille Paglia in her 1990 work Sexual Personae, which has in its first chapter an absolutely blistering theory of the entire Western tradition. I'm going to have a lot of quotes here on the sides of the screen. I'm not going to read through these, but you can always read those if you find them interesting. Paglia centers her entire analysis of the Western tradition on this idea that nature is the supreme moral problem we face. For Paglia, nature is not nice. It is overwhelming, terrifying. It is, her words, daemonic, with an A. It is hierarchical, violent, and indifferent to human life. To refer to nature, she uses the word chthonic, which in the past the word Dionysian has been used, but chthonic is more expressive, this idea of being of the earth, but more specifically of the bowels of the earth, the murk, the rot, and the grinding of blind impersonal forces. By contrast, society for Paglia is a defense against the overwhelming hostility of nature. And nature, by the way, in the external world, storms, predatory animals, and so on, and in the internal world, the functioning of our own bodies, of our psyches, of our needs, the fact that we get sick, all of these vulnerabilities that come from embodiment. For Paglia, society is a system of inherited forms, reducing our humiliating passivity to nature. It involves the imposing form, setting of boundaries, making things visible. So naming things, mathematical systems, scientific systems are all examples of the imposition of a kind of order onto nature for the purpose of reducing our passivity to it. She uses the word Apollonian to describe this impulse for detaching, separating from nature, and projecting outwards away from it. So if you want to think of Paglia's position, you can think of it as being anti-Rousseau against the benevolent view of nature that Rousseau puts forward, and pro Marquis de Sade, this idea that cruelty, violation, dominance are aspects, fundamental aspects of nature if we're looking at it truthfully. Now, for Paglia, the Apollonian ideal is both the source of both the greatness and also the neurosis of the Western tradition. For her, science, philosophy, mathematics are all attempts to make nature knowable. They emerge from what she calls an eye-centric epistemology. We use our eyes in order to engage and reckon with things. And we do that basically because we want to control nature. The problem with this is that all of this is possible only on the basis of the repression of the chthonic elements of our engagement with reality, the levels at which there is an instability of form, a lack of solid identity, flux, change, anything that emerges from an epistemology of immersion in things and a lack of distinction between things as opposed to a distance from things. So, if this is our framework, a lot of us are already probably thinking that this is directly relevant to 40K. I would like to argue, core interpretive thesis, 40K is at its core a response to a what if question, building on this previous framework. What if civilization and nature, the Apollonian and the Chthonic, were fundamentally opposed to one another with absolutely no possibility of commensuration or rapprochement? That is, I'm claiming the fundamental hypothetical of 40K, or at least one way of thinking about that. I'm not trying to be unnecessarily universalizing with my thesis here. In other words, what I'm saying 40K does is dramatizes the central conflict of the Western tradition by taking its core metaphors and expressing them literally. Excuse me. So, We have heard said about 40K many times that it is a quote, fundamentally broken universe. It's metaphysically broken. And the reason for that is because the universe is split into the materium and the immaterium, the warp. The warp is the realm of chaos. Chaos is by definition malevolent, untrustworthy, and hostile. Anyone who serves it is necessarily being manipulated, being mistreated, becomes a slave to darkness. Possibly with the exception of Abaddon the Despoiler, maybe he's the Ubermensch, I'm not sure. I'm skeptical about that. Basically everyone becomes a slave to darkness. Chaos, I claim, is a dramatization of the chthonic. It is a dramatization of the idea of blind, grinding forces, demonic cruelty, formlessness. Specifically, it's not just a dramatization of these factors, it's an exaggeration of chthonic realities that points out the aspects of them that are utterly incommensurable with human life or human interests. Now, it's interesting to pause and think about the chaos gods for a second. What the in-universe explanation for the chaos gods is that they're basically extruded emotion, that human being or sentient creatures have certain strong emotional experiences, they coalesce in the warp, they form gods. This makes sense for Khorne, it makes sense for Slaanesh. Khorne is, of course, aggression, rage, bloodlust. Slaanesh is sensuality, eroticism. That corresponds very nicely to the Freudian unconscious, to aggressive and sexual impulses that are repressed and then sort of surge back into consciousness. What about Tzeentch and Nurgle, though? In terms of Tzeentch has the emotions, maybe, of scheming and ambition associated with them. But Tzeentch is also about manipulation, hubris, change. That doesn't seem to fit into this framework so much. What I think is going on with Tzeentch is that it represents the failures or the limits of reason. This idea, Magnus the Red, Ahriman after him, are these supremely rational figures who are undone by their hubris of thinking that they know, thinking that they have insight, thinking that they have rational mastery, and then being undone, being hoisted by their own petard. I think what Tzeentch represents is the kind of overcoming of the Apollonian ideal, this kind of cruel laughter at the hubris of people who think that they could actually have knowledge. And then what about Nurgle? Nurgle is about their emotion of despair, of course, but Nurgle is also much more fundamentally about disease, decay, death, the breakdown of the body, finality. What Nurgle is expressing, I think, is what Palia calls the messy biological business as usual of the human body. The fact that reason does not exist as this kind of disembodied force, that the ego is not this permanently existing thing, that we are bound to these flesh prisons that we inhabit, we can't get away from them, and we're controlled by them. This is, I think, is the idea of Nurgle. And so I think the notion of the chthonic is actually, or abjection, to use Julia Kristeva's term, is not is actually more adequate as a description for the chaos gods than the in-universe description. Now, of course, by contrast, the emperor is the paradigmatic Apollonian figure. He is the embodiment of clarity, order, transcendence. He is radiant and monumental, also importantly detached. There's something a little bit inhuman about the emperor. He is disconnected from human interests. In fact, he develops that way. In Veldor, Birth of the Imperium, he points out that he is becoming more inhuman. That is something that sort of reaches its full form in the Great Crusade. The emperor is structured by the drive for illumination. The phrase illuminate them is one of the battle cries of the Space Marines. He drives for unification, for order, something like a Platonic philosopher king who rules because of his intuition of the form of the good and is perfectly uninterested in his own sort of goals. He can pursue it in a disinterested way. Similarly, the Great Crusade is an imposition of linearity, and structure on the disorder of the cosmos. It is this march of progress, this forward movement, classification, administration of this broken up galaxy. Space Marines, similarly, are instruments of a certain kind of very phallic concentration and projection. This idea that they can march out, that they can conquer things, they can project force in a specific way. Of course, with phallic projection, there comes a collapse afterwards, which is maybe a premonition of how things are going to turn out with the Great Crusade. Then, of course, there's the imperial truth, which is atheistic, rationalistic, materialist, denies superstition, denies the warp. Now, the problem is that 10,000 years later, after everything that happens in the Horus Heresy and afterwards, the Crusade era Imperium has decayed into a horrific, hypertrophied version of its original Apollonian ideals. It has a dogmatic religion, a fascist cult of the military, complete indifference to the individual, and total sacrifice to the state. Seen in the example of servitors, for example, the brutal surgery done on very often innocent human beings to turn them into machines with one function for the state. There is administrative bloat, bureaucratic stasis. Also, all of these Gothic, extremely overly ornate cathedrals, this kind of testament to a certain kind of sky cult that they are always pushing towards. What we see, I think, in the 41st millennium is a type of, there's the instinct of the Apollonian to be repression that is hardened and ossified and intensified into a grotesque form. It is an exaggeration of an internal aspect of the Apollonian in its most extreme and desperate form of escape and defense. Now, why do we care about this? Why does this matter to us? Now, when we're talking about Apollonian and Dionysian or Chthonic, it might come across as being a bit abstract and divorced from experience, but the Apollonian ideal is a structuring force of the Western tradition, according to Palia, and has a concrete historical form, particularly the European Enlightenment. And the historical trajectory of the Enlightenment, I think, is very nicely expressed, very nicely expresses the aims and contradictions of the Apollonian ideal. There's a kind of quest for categorization, form, mastery. There is an exclusion of something that is chthonic, and there is a resulting crisis. I want to point out here briefly that I'm interpreting the Enlightenment as a Weltanschauung, so I'm interpreting it sociologically. There are individual Enlightenment figures who go beyond some of the problems that I'm talking about here, but I'm talking about it as an era with a certain characteristic style of thought. So I'm just going to talk about science and nature here, but I have some other examples as well we can look at if you'd like. In terms of the Enlightenment view of nature, it views nature as something inert, something that is mechanical, external to us. It can be seen with our eyes. It exists to be measured and studied and used as a resource. What's excluded from that? What's excluded is something about nature as an autonomous system, something with thresholds, something with feedback loops, with its own intrinsic rhythms. And the results of this this historical result, this thing that we are seeing now in our world, is industrial exploitation, ecological crises, climate change, pollution, extinction, destabilized planetary systems, breaching of carrying capacity of the Earth. Similar things happen with Enlightenment views of knowledge that go from abstract objectivity into an ignorance of the sort of perspectival, power-laden natures of truth, leading in the 20th century to the masters of suspicion, postmodernism, and relativism. This collapse of this Enlightenment idea of a rational, disembodied subject that excludes irrationality, emotions, dreams, the unconscious embodiment, leading now to a situation where there is, of course, we speak about there being a mental health crisis, rise of depth psychology, psychotherapy, also the existence of mysticism, alternative spiritualities. Listen, I feel like we're running out of time here, but we can talk about this more at the end. What I want to say is that the obvious horrors of the 40K universe are meant to remind us of some of the breakdowns of the Apollonian ideal that we see in the world around us. Ecological catastrophes, incursions of demonic forces, rise of authoritarianism, the collapse of knowledge, the collapse of knowing what is true, even the idea that truth might be horrible, that we don't want to have truth. So, here's my conclusion. Why do we care about 40K? What we find in 40K, I think, is a grotesque exaggeration of real-world anxieties and crises. And what it does is it gives us a dreamlike language of impressions and metaphors, as well as an etiology for these problems. It shows us these problems in a way that is affectively engaging for us, and then it tells us where they come from. It comes from a metaphysically broken universe. The reason why we respond to this and why this is part of our cultural dream work is because we ourselves are post-enlightenment subjects. We are shaped to our essence by a world that is coming off of the end of certain crises in the Enlightenment. For more discussion of this, I'm following Adorno and Horkheimer dialectic of enlightenment here. And so because of this, we find 40K compelling because we want to understand the world around us and we want to understand ourselves. And it gives us a way of engaging with this. Palia says that poetry is the connecting link between body and mind, or art is. So every idea in poetry is grounded in emotion. Our emotional reaction to 40K is, I think, always our own form of dream work. Unlike 40K, we're almost at the end now, we in the real world are not stuck in a fundamentally broken universe. There are thinkers who have tried to go beyond the divide, this disjunctive synthesis I've been speaking about. In particular, Jungian depth psychology tries to resolve this tension, quote, not by going back to nature, but by holding on to the level of reason we have successfully reached and by enriching consciousness with knowledge of man's psychic foundations, as is expressed in this picture from Jung's Red Book over here. So, what 40K gives us to conclude is a dramatization of the conflict between the Apollonian and the Chthonic in a way that lets us take them up as our own. It lets us engage with ideas affectively that might otherwise be too abstract or elusive to grapple with. To the extent that we're stuck in this conflict, you and I, are like the emperor right here on the golden throne, desperately holding on to our Apollonian bulwarks while pushing back the Chthonic onslaught. All right, thank you so much for your time. I deeply appreciate it. Look forward to conversation.